human relationships, and it's very difficult to have a relationship with other humans. Learning objective is to discuss how crisis affects the counseling process, and discuss the management of crisis, and discuss the steps of risk management. So, what is crisis? Crisis is sudden or unexpected event. When you're expecting an event, it's not a crisis anymore because you're expecting it to occur. Something that you don't expect, like the pandemic, is not expected. We thought that it's just a simple virus that you can just kill the person who has a virus, and then uh, the virus is gone. But it unexpectedly spread throughout the country, and after the country, it crossed another country and becomes a pandemic. When it crosses countries and becomes the whole world and the global thing, it's called a pandemic. And that is a crisis leading to the major unrest amongst the individuals at the workplace in an organization. In other words, crisis is defined as an emergency situation which disturbs the employees as well as leads to instability of the organization. And the crisis affects an individual group or organization, society as a whole. Now, uh, if you have a crisis, you need to learn how to manage it. And proper communication will help you manage the crisis, because crisis management is the art of dealing with sudden and unexpected event which disturbs the employees organization as well as external clients. That refers to crisis management, and the purpose of handling unexpected and sudden changes in an organization or culture is called the crisis management. All right. Now, crisis management's goal is to seek or minimize damages, because you cannot do away with the damage. Once the crisis has occurred, damage will always be there. So all you need to do is minimize it. However, due to the crisis that has the same thing that responses over and over again, it has to have a comprehensive process that needs to be put in practice before it happens again for the many times. A pandemic can happen again after 10 years, and we have to be ready for that. I think 100 years, whatever that is, it can happen again. And, a crisis management is something that puts you into practice so that if it happens again, you will be more prepared in the engagement before, during, and after. So, the need for crisis management is to prepare you to face unexpected developments and adverse conditions in the organization with the courage and determination to face it. Employees adjust well to the sudden changes in the organization, and employees can understand and analyze the cause of crisis and cope with it in the best possible way. So, you cannot really solve it, but you can just cope. Crisis management helps the managers to devise strategies to come out of uncertain conditions, and also decide on the future course of action. And the crisis management helps managers to feel uh, the early signs of crisis, or warns the employees against the aftermaths and take necessary precautions for the same crisis that can occur. So, emotional arousal will always happen in a crisis. In order to make the best use of our emotions, it becomes important to us to enable to identify how we feel at any given moment. So the psychologists have developed the theory of emotional granularity to help us with just adjusting it, and according to this arousal, the degree to which we experience them can be pleasant or unpleasant, known as a valence. And emotions that are characterized as having high arousal would be emotions such as joy, anger, enthusiasm, anxiety. Sometimes we are so anxious of the crisis that we're trying to encounter. And the low arousal emotions would include depression as well, but it can be calmed down because of a crisis management in psychological terms. So, um, the valence that is known on the joy, anger, enthusiasm, and anxiety, these are the low emotions. They could be depressions as well. So, you are probably feeling an emotion that are characterized by high levels of arousal, and these emotional arousal must be handled through crisis management. As you can see, this is a person who is freaking out, right? So, yeah, she's the one with the anger or something that is surprised, or they have this personality that loses self-esteem, or something that loses the control or the ability to control their emotions. The experience of this emotion then arouses and energizes the person to act. So you have to manage conversation with emotional people. When the conversation goes poorly, it's often because some elements of our psychical for information has been triggered in a way that compromises our responses being artful, caring, and empathetic or therapeutic. The difficult conversation is largely about feelings or about respecting, acknowledging, and controlling them, especially when you tell them that the patient in the ICU is dead. You know, that is their husband. They're thinking that my husband was so strong yesterday. You know, how come he's dead now? So there are crises that you need to acknowledge in a conversation. And a key error that health professional make in difficult conversation is thinking that the conversation is information. It's not just information, but also largely getting their feelings and getting them control their feelings when the crisis occur. So theoretical model of emergency decision making that focuses on decision makers answer the basic question evoked by warning or signs of danger, and effective emergency decisions are most likely to be made according to the theory when a vigilant coping pattern is dominant, which requires that the following four mediating conditions are met. So the first is the awareness of serious risk, and this is if no protective action is taken, and the awareness of serious risk if any of the salient protective actions are taken, and the moderate or high degree of hope that a search for information and advice will lead to a better solution, and belief that there are sufficient time to search and deliberate before any serious threat will materialize. When one or another of these conditions are not met, a defective coping pattern such as defensive avoidance or hypervigilance will be dominant, and which will generally lead to maladaptive actions. And in addition to suggesting new interventions for facilitating adaptive behavior in emergencies, the theoretical model provides the basis for integrating desperate findings from psychological research on the effects of warning and confrontations with danger. So these are the elements of crisis response. You know, they have operational management response and communication response. So the risk assessment is defined as can be an accident, hazard, or a risk. And the risk assessment have number one, identification of hazards, which is the step one. Anything that may cause harm are hazards, and employers have duty to assess and the health and safety risks faced by their workers. So these are classification of hazard: physical, mental, chemical, and biological. Physical is something that you use for your physical anatomy, and mental is something that you use your psychiatric mentality. Chemical is something that is chemically combined, and biological is something that is it can be a virus, it can be a healthcare worker, it can be a home care staff or healthcare professional. Those are biological. So the step two is to decide who may be harmed and how. That now that you have identified the hazards, you have to identify who are potential for acquiring the hazards. You know, there are some vulnerable populations, so to speak. Next is to assess the risk and take action. Now that you have identified the vulnerable populations, you have to assess those risks and take action. So make a record of the findings. If you have taken actions, you have to record it because documentation is very important. What is not written is not done. So even if you took action, if you don't record it, it's considered as it is not done. So review the risk assessment. A risk assessment must be kept under review in order to ensure that agreed safe working practices continue to be applied and take account of any new working practices, new machinery, or more demanding work targets. So this is the stages of crisis management. Now, planning on risk assessment is before you do the crisis management. What is a pre-crisis? Pre-crisis is the key to effective planning as to involve as many stakeholders as possible. And in that way, all areas of organization are represented in the risk identification and risk planning process. Corporate risk response teams often include representatives from the organization's legal, human resources, finance, and operations staff. It is also customary to identify someone to act as crisis managers. So, what is the crisis response management? When a crisis occurs, the crisis manager is responsible for directing organization into the response. The post-crisis resolution is something that you after a crisis you subside and the business returns again or begins to return to normal. The crisis manager should continue to meet with members of the crisis management team, especially those from the legal and finance departments. So following the crisis, it is also important for the crisis management team to revisit the organization's crisis management plan within the goal of evaluating how well the plan worked and what aspects of the plan needs to be revised based on what was learned. So everybody loves a nurse because they have crisis management, they have communication process. Okay, so this ends the topic.